the president, if he wants Iran to compromise on the nuclear front, I do believe that now that the Iranian nuclear program has been significantly degraded, the Iranians are much more prepared to compromise. However, if he wants to move the goalposts and now include the missile program, Iran's regional activities, or human rights situation also on the table, then it becomes very difficult for the Iranian regime to agree to those terms. In fact, I would argue, going as far as saying that the only thing that the Iranians would believe is more dangerous for their survival than a U.S. strike is submitting to U.S. terms.
Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has arrived in Geneva for a high-stakes second round of nuclear talks with the United States, with plenty of speculation about a major U.S. military build-up in the Gulf and the possibility of renewed military confrontation. The Geneva talks come over a month after Iran's deadly crackdown on nationwide anti-regime protests, which saw tens of thousands of protesters killed and injured. At the time, President Trump told the protesters, quote, help was on the way. Iranian officials justified the mass killing by claiming terrorists armed and funded by the US and Israel were behind the civil unrest. Let's talk now to Ali Vaez. He's an Iran specialist at the International Crisis Group in Washington, D.C. Ali Vaez, you watch very closely what is happening in Iran and to the diplomacy between Iran and the United States. Do you believe you know what Donald Trump actually wants right now? Does he want a deal or does he want confrontation?
It's good to be with you. Look, President Trump is notoriously unpredictable, but it is clear through years of consistent statements that he is interested in a deal with Iran. But if he can't get the kind of deal that he wants, then his plan B is war. And he has also said that repeatedly to the Iranians, especially in his second term. When he came to office, he sent a letter to the Supreme Leader and he said, you have a binary choice. Either do a deal with me or I will strike you. And he did last year. And we were at that point again.
How can he get what he wants? Because as I understand it, he wants the complete elimination of Iran's uranium enrichment program, the giving up of all uranium stocks by the Iranians, and that is being described by the Tehran government as submission, and they simply will not submit.
So you're putting your finger on the exact right point here, which is that the president, if he wants Iran to compromise on the nuclear front, I do believe that now that the Iranian nuclear program has been significantly degraded, the Iranians are much more prepared to compromise. However, if he wants to move the goalposts and now include the missile program, Iran's regional activities, or human rights situation also on the table, then it becomes very difficult for the Iranian regime to agree to those terms. In fact, I would argue, going as far as saying that the only thing that the Iranians would believe is more dangerous for their survival than a U.S. strike is submitting to U.S. terms.
That's an interesting way of putting it. We know the Israelis are also watching this very closely. Mr. Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, had a meeting with Donald Trump last week. His message is clearly that if the Americans don't get promises not just on the ending of uranium enrichment, but also on the curbing of the ballistic missiles program and the end of Iranian support for proxies around the Middle East region, then as far as the Israelis are concerned, the U.S. has a duty to strike. How influential do you think the Israelis are in Donald Trump's ear?
Enormously influential, but the reality is that at the end of the day, the president does not want an all-out war. If he had the option of some sort of limited military intervention, as he did last year, the U.S. only bombed Iran for 45 minutes in the course of the 12-day war between Iran and Israel. If he had an option like that, and he knew that the consequences would be containable and controllable, he might have resorted to military options, even until now. I do believe, however, he understands that this time things are different. This time the Iranian regime believes that the threat against it is existential, and so it's going to go all out. And then there is a risk that a bilateral confrontation between Iran and the U.S. will turn into a regional conflagration. Now, Israel might not necessarily care about the consequences of that, but the U.S. would own the consequences. And the president, certainly in an election year, does not want to go that far.
Let's flip this around and talk about the other possibility that a deal can be done. I mean, how much wiggle room do you think the Islamic regime has to change its entire rhetoric toward the United States? I note that in recent days, some Iranian officials have been sort of suggesting there might be extraordinary economic deals to be done. If only the Americans will compromise with us, they should understand that there are energy deals, mining deals, other trade deals to be done, which could make them a lot of money. But if they were to be serious about that, they'd have to completely change their rhetoric toward the great Satan, America. Can they do that and still retain their credibility with their core hardline supporters at home?
Well, that's exactly where the tension lies in the Iranian strategy. They know that in the Trumpian language, if you offer economic and commercial incentives, you can get the president's attention. But at the same time, they're not willing to go as far as normalizing relations with the United States, which has a major requirement, which is to drop their proactive hostility against Israel as well. And so the Iranians believe that just by compromising on the nuclear issue and by providing some sort of a economic incentive, they can get Trump to a deal. In the same way that Trump believes that just by pressure, whether economic or military, he can get the Iranian regime to capitulate. Both sides are wrong, and this is going to end in grief if they don't change their approach.
Well, you say this is going to end in grief. Two very quick-fire questions for you, Ali, but they must be brief answers. Number one, do you think Iran will agree to essentially abandon its uranium enrichment program, that is the sort of potential military use of nuclear capability?
Yes, I do, because it is acknowledging facts on the ground. Iran has not enriched a gram of uranium in the past 6 months. So if it agrees to suspend the program in the long run, it has not actually conceded anything.
And second question, in your considered view, how likely is military confrontation within weeks or, let's say, months?
I'm afraid the odds of a war are much higher than the odds of a deal. Simply because of the gaps that we discussed, and also because with so much military equipment concentrated in a relatively narrow geographic zone, there is plenty of risk for miscalculation and false flag operations as well.
Well, that's a bleak conclusion, but Ali Vaez from the International Crisis Group, that is a very good reason why we should keep in very close touch with you over the coming weeks and months. Thanks very much for joining us on The Times at 1. Thank you.